Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into a world where a fever was not just an illness but a visitation. Something that could enter a cottage, a castle, a monastery, or a battlefield camp and quietly rearrange every certainty people thought they had. To modern eyes, fever is a symptom. To medieval people, it could feel like a message from the body, the air, the planets, God, bad water, spoiled food, or an invisible imbalance no one could fully see. Before we settle into that world, let me know where you're watching from and what history topic you'd like to drift through next. If you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, a like is a simple way to support it. And if you'd like more calm, quietly fascinating history videos, you're very welcome to subscribe. So let's begin not with the Great Plague, or a famous king, or a dramatic battlefield, but with something smaller, more ordinary, and in many ways more frightening. A person waking in medieval Europe with heat rising under the skin. First, it might not seem like much. A man in a village near the edge of a forest opens his eyes before dawn, before the hearth has been stirred back into life, and notices that his mouth is dry. His limbs feel heavy. His shirt clings faintly to his back. The room is dim, cool, and smoky, but inside his body there is a strange warmth that does not belong to the morning. He may lie still for a while, listening to the sounds of the house around him. Someone shifting in the straw, a child breathing, a pot settling near the ashes, an animal moving outside the wall. In a modern household, this would be the moment for a thermometer, a glass of water, perhaps a message to a doctor, perhaps medicine from a cabinet. But in the medieval world, the first question was not, how high is the temperature? It was, what kind of heat is this? And what does it mean? That is one of the most important differences to understand. Medieval people were not simply confused versions of us, waiting for modern medicine to arrive. They had systems of explanation, habits of observation, remedies passed through families, advice from learned physicians, prayers from priests, and practical knowledge learned the hard way from surviving illness after illness. Some of their ideas were wrong by modern standards. Some were incomplete. Some were shaped by religion, astrology, and ancient Greek medical theory. But many were attempts to answer real questions with the tools available to them. A fever was frightening because it was both visible and mysterious. You could see the flushed face. You could feel the hot forehead. You could hear the restless breathing. But you could not see the cause. There was no microscope, no germ theory, no laboratory test that could distinguish influenza from typhus, malaria, wound infection, pneumonia, food poisoning, or any of the many fevers that moved through medieval lives. Fever was not one disease. It was a signpost pointing into a dark forest. And that forest was crowded. In medieval Europe, illness lived close to daily life. The household was not a clean, sealed space separate from animals, smoke, mud, insects, and waste. The village was tied to fields, streams, barns, dung heaps, and burial grounds. Towns, when they grew prosperous, also grew dense and foul-smelling, with narrow streets, crowded rooms, open drains, market refuse, butchered animals, contaminated wells, and travelers arriving from places no one could fully trace. Monasteries could be cleaner and better organized than many secular dwellings, but they too faced infection, hunger, fatigue, and the limits of available care. To live through a medieval fever, then, was to become suddenly aware of how thin the wall was between ordinary routine and bodily danger. The day before, a person might have been cutting grain, carrying water, baking bread, copying a manuscript, selling cloth, serving in a noble household, walking behind a cart, or tending a child. By morning, that same person might be lying under a blanket, watched by family members who were trying to decide whether this was a passing heat, a dangerous ague, a punishment, a seasonal corruption, or the beginning of something that might spread. The word fever itself carried a range of meanings. Medieval Latin, medical texts, local speech, and household vocabulary all had ways of describing heat, chills, burning, shaking, sweating, weakness, and delirium. People might speak of an ague, especially when the fever came with chills and recurring fits. They might notice whether the heat rose at certain times of day. They might ask whether the patient shivered first, then burned, then sweated. They might wonder whether the fever was continuous, intermittent, mild, malignant, dry, wet, hot, cold, or tied to some excess within the body. This may sound strange to us, but observation mattered. Without modern diagnostics, pattern was everything. Did the fever come every day, every other day, every third day? Did the patient thirst for water or reject it? Was the tongue dry? Was there vomiting, diarrhea, rash, cough, pain in the side, swelling, or confusion? Did the urine look dark, cloudy, red, pale, thick, or full of sediment? Medieval physicians, especially those trained in university medicine, paid close attention to urine. A flask of urine could be studied for color, smell, texture, and deposits, and while this practice could not reveal disease the way modern tests can, it represented a real attempt to read the body through its visible signs. But many people never saw a learned physician. For most villagers and laborers, care began at home. A wife, mother, neighbor, servant, monk, nun, or local healer might be the first to respond. The sick person might be moved closer to the hearth or away from it, depending on whether chills or heat dominated. Blankets might be added or removed. Water, ale, broth, or herbal drinks might be offered. The patient might be encouraged to sweat, because sweating could be seen as the body pushing out what troubled it. At other times, cooling remedies might be used to calm excessive heat. Here we find one of the central tensions of medieval fever care. The body was believed to need correction, but correction could be risky. The dominant learned medical framework in much of medieval Europe came from ancient Greek and Roman medicine, especially the humoral tradition associated with Hippocrates, Galen, and later Arabic medical writers whose works deeply shaped medieval learning. According to this view, health depended on the balance of four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These were connected to qualities such as hot, cold, wet, and dry. Fever, in broad terms, could be understood as a dangerous heat arising from imbalance, corruption, or disturbance within the body. This did not mean every medieval person could recite Galenic theory. Many could not, but the ideas filtered downward in simplified forms. Some foods were warming, others cooling. Some bodies were more prone to certain conditions. Seasons mattered, age mattered, the air mattered, excess needed to be moderated. What a person ate, drank, breathed, expelled, and endured all belonged to a moral and physical universe where balance was fragile. So a fever might lead to changes in diet. Heavy foods could be avoided. Broths might be offered because they were easier to digest. Wine could be watered. Barley water, potages, or herbal preparations might be used. Certain plants had reputations for easing heat, encouraging sweat, calming the stomach, or strengthening the patient. Some remedies were practical. Some were symbolic. Some were harmless. Some could be dangerous. The medieval sickroom was therefore not passive. It was full of decisions. Should the patient be bled? Should they be purged? Should they be cooled? Should they be warmed? Should they fast? Should they eat? Should the priest be called now, or only if the signs worsen? Should neighbors enter or stay away? Should the household keep working, or arrange help? Should a charm be spoken? Should a relic be touched? Should someone walk to a monastery infirmary or an apothecary in town? Each question carried consequences because illness did not pause the economy of survival. In a peasant household, one adult fever could mean work left undone. Grain might not be harvested at the right moment. Animals might not be tended properly. Rent and labor obligations might still be expected. In a noble household, fever could disrupt service, inheritance, marriage plans, travel, or political arrangements. In a monastery, a feverish monk might remove one voice from the choir, one pair of hands from the scriptorium, one official from the management of lands. In an army, fever could be more destructive than weapons. This is why medieval fever cannot be understood only as a medical event. It was also a social event. The sick person's body became the center of a small circle of worry. Family members watched for signs. The community listened for rumors. If more than one person fell ill, fear widened. Was it bad air? Was it corrupted water? Was it the season? Had travelers brought something? Was God displeased? Had the household failed in some duty? These questions did not belong to separate categories the way we might divide medicine, religion, and environment today. In medieval thinking, they could overlap. A fever could be natural and spiritual at the same time. This is one of the places where modern viewers often misunderstand the medieval world. It is easy to imagine that people chose either medicine or prayer, either herbs or faith, either practical care or religious meaning. In reality, they often used all of them together. A person might receive herbal drinks, be kept warm, have urine inspected, be bled according to medical advice, pray to a saint, confess sins, and ask for a relic to be brought near the bed. These actions did not necessarily contradict one another. They belonged to a worldview in which the body, soul, environment, and divine order were connected. And in the heat of a fever, that connection could feel immediate. As the fever rose, time changed. Hours became less reliable. The patient might drift between waking and sleep. The room might seem too bright or too dark. Sweat might gather at the neck and chest. Chills might come suddenly, so violent that the teeth struck together. Then the heat might return, leaving the skin dry and burning. Someone might touch the forehead with the back of a hand. Someone might whisper that the fever had broken, only to find it returning that evening. The alternation of chills and heat was especially unnerving. A person could feel frozen while others felt the burning skin. This contradiction seemed to demand explanation. How could the body be hot and cold at once? Humoral medicine offered one answer: corrupt matter, blocked heat, imbalance, and internal struggle could produce conflicting sensations. The body was not a machine in the modern sense. It was a landscape of qualities, flows, and obstructions. And then there was delirium. For many medieval families, delirium may have been the most frightening part of a serious fever. A patient might speak to people who were not present. They might mutter prayers, names, fragments of work, or nonsense. They might try to rise when too weak to stand. They might see insects, flames, faces, demons, angels, or dead relatives. To a modern doctor, fever delirium can be explained through the effects of infection, dehydration, inflammation, and stress on the brain. To a medieval household, it could feel like the boundary between worlds had thinned. This did not always mean panic. Medieval people were familiar with suffering in a way modern comfortable societies often are not. They had seen childbirth, injury, hunger, and sudden death. They knew bodies could fail. But familiarity did not erase fear. It only gave fear a ritual shape. A priest might be called if the fever seemed grave. Confession, communion, and anointing were not merely signs that death was expected. They were forms of care, preparation, and reassurance. The sick person's soul mattered as urgently as the body. For family members, spiritual rites could provide structure when practical remedies seemed uncertain. They gave people something to do, something to say, and some hope that the person in the bed was not alone. At the same time, medieval medicine could be surprisingly attentive to comfort. Infirmaries in monasteries, for example, were often among the more carefully arranged spaces in a religious house. The sick might receive better food, softer bedding, or exemptions from the normal strictness of communal life. This was not universal, and conditions varied widely, but the ideal of caring for the sick was deeply embedded in Christian duty. Hospitals, too, though very different from modern hospitals, often served as places of shelter, charity, and basic care for the poor, pilgrims, elderly, and ill. Yet even in the best circumstances, a fever remained uncertain. One reason was that medieval Europe had no single fever experience. A fever in a damp lowland region might be tied to marshy conditions and recurring agues. A fever in a crowded city might follow contaminated water or epidemic disease. A fever after childbirth could signal infection. A fever after a wound could mean the slow, terrifying progress of pus, swelling, and blood poisoning. A fever in a child could pass quickly or turn fatal before anyone understood why. A fever during famine could strike a body already weakened by poor diet. A fever in winter might come with respiratory illness, while summer brought its own dangers through heat, spoilage, insects, and bad water. So when we say a medieval fever, we are really talking about a whole family of experiences. Some ended with recovery after days of sweating and weakness. Some returned again and again for months. Some changed a person permanently, leaving them thin, exhausted, or unable to work as before. Some carried off the young and strong with shocking speed. The uncertainty was part of the suffering. A household might spend days reading the patient's body like a weather sign. A better night could bring hope. A worse morning could undo it. If the patient sweated heavily, someone might say the body was casting off the illness. If the appetite returned, that was encouraging. If the urine cleared, that could be taken as a good sign. If the hands grew cold while the face burned, if breathing grew shallow, if the eyes seemed distant, the room would change. Voices would lower. People would stop pretending this was ordinary. And yet many people did recover. This matters because the medieval world was not simply a place where everyone fell ill and died helplessly. People survived fevers constantly. Their survival shaped memory, remedy, and belief. A child who lived after a dangerous fever might be offered in gratitude to a saint's protection. A remedy used before recovery might gain a reputation in the family. A physician's advice might be remembered as wise. A prayer, pilgrimage, or vow might become part of the story. Survival did not prove a remedy worked in the modern scientific sense, but it helped build the emotional logic of care. When a fever broke, the experience was not over. The first cool morning after days of heat might feel almost unreal. The patient's skin no longer burned. Their thoughts became clearer. They asked for food. They recognized faces without confusion. But weakness remained. In a world without modern calories, antibiotics, or paid sick leave, recovery could be slow and precarious. Standing might cause dizziness. Walking across the room might be exhausting. Returning to the fields or workshop too soon could bring relapse. A household might need to stretch food, labor, and patience around a person who was alive but not yet useful. For the poor, this could be devastating. Illness was expensive even when no doctor was paid. Cost time, labor, food, favors, and obligations. Someone had to fetch water, prepare drinks, tend the fire, clean bedding, remove waste, and perhaps sit through the night. If a healer, barber surgeon, physician, priest, or apothecary was involved, there might be payments, gifts, or debts. If the patient was a wage laborer, income vanished. If they were responsible for seasonal work, the timing of fever could decide whether the household endured the winter comfortably or entered it already strained. This is where the quiet cruelty of medieval fever becomes clearer. It was not only the burning body. It was the way illness exposed the fragility of everything around the body. A fever could reveal whether a family had neighbors willing to help. could reveal whether a lord was flexible or harsh, could reveal whether stored grain was sufficient. It could reveal whether a town's water was safe, whether a dwelling was overcrowded, whether a wound had been cleaned, whether a child had enough strength to survive another infection. Fever was personal, but it was also a test of the world that surrounded the sufferer. And for those with wealth, the experience was different, but not free from fear. A noble or prosperous merchant might have access to trained physicians, imported remedies, cleaner bedding, servants, and more varied food. Their urine might be inspected by someone educated in medical texts. Their pulse might be considered. Their astrological conditions might be discussed. A regimen might be prescribed: what to eat, when to sleep, whether to open windows, whether to avoid anger, sexual activity, heavy food, cold air, or excessive movement. But wealth could not guarantee survival. Kings, bishops, queens, abbots, knights, and wealthy merchants all died of fevers. Status could soften the bed, but it could not remove the mystery. In fact, status sometimes increased the pressure around illness. If a ruler developed a fever, the sickroom became political. Access mattered. Rumors mattered. The timing of recovery or death could shift alliances, inheritances, marriages, wars, and successions. A fever that in a cottage caused grief and hardship could in a royal chamber unsettle a kingdom. The same heat beneath the skin could have vastly different consequences depending on whose body carried it. And still, in the room itself, the basic human scene remained familiar. Someone lying awake, someone watching, someone hoping the next hour would be better. To understand how medieval people responded to fever, we also need to understand their environment of smell and air. Medieval medicine placed great importance on air quality. Bad air or corrupted air was believed to cause or worsen illness. This idea is often mocked from a modern point of view, especially when contrasted with germ theory. But the belief was not foolish in its context. People noticed that disease could cluster in foul, crowded, stagnant places. They noticed that marshes, rotting matter, corpses, waste, and certain seasons seemed connected with sickness. They did not know about microbes, but they could observe that some environments were dangerous. So in a fever, the air around the patient mattered. A room might be aired, scented, fumigated, or protected with aromatic herbs. Sweet-smelling substances were not merely pleasant. They were thought to resist corruption. Rosemary, lavender, vinegar, incense, juniper, or other aromatics might be used depending on region, availability, and status. The wealthy could afford more elaborate scents. The poor used what they had. A pleasant smell could signal cleanliness, order, and protection, even if it did not work the way people believed. This attention to air also shaped responses to epidemic fever. When many people became ill, authorities might try to clean streets, remove waste, regulate burial, restrict movement, or avoid certain places. These measures varied by time and place, and they were often imperfect. But they show that medieval and late medieval communities were not entirely passive. They acted within the limits of their understanding. The difficulty was that fever did not always obey visible logic. One person drank from the same well and lived. Another sickened. One child recovered. Another died. A traveler passed through and nothing happened, or perhaps weeks later half a street was ill. Without germ theory, these patterns could seem morally and cosmically charged. People searched for meaning because randomness is hard to endure. If illness appeared arbitrary, then explanation became a form of emotional survival. This is why saints mattered. A feverish person might be placed under the care of a particular saint associated with healing. Pilgrimages to shrines could be made by the sick or on their behalf. Wax offerings shaped like body parts might be presented. Vows might be promised if recovery came. Holy water, relics, and prayers could enter the sickroom not as theatrical superstition, but as part of a deeply serious care system. For people with few reliable cures, spiritual hope was not an accessory. It was one of the main forms of endurance. But there was another side to this, one more troubling. If illness could be interpreted spiritually, then sufferers could also fear blame. A fever might be seen by some as correction, punishment, trial, or warning. This did not mean every sick person was condemned. Christian thought also emphasized compassion for the suffering. But the moral atmosphere around illness could be heavy. A patient might examine their conscience while their body weakened. Family members might wonder what vow had been neglected, what sin confessed too late, what sign had been missed. In this way, fever heated not only the body but memory. As the days passed, the patient might become a kind of archive of anxieties. Food eaten, water drunk, places visited, sins committed, whether endured, contacts made, dreams seen, omens noticed. Every detail could be reconsidered. The ordinary past became suspicious. And this is perhaps one of the most human parts of the medieval fever experience, because even now, when we are ill, we often look backward. We ask where it came from. We ask what we touched, what we ate, whom we stood beside. Medieval people asked those questions too, but their answers belong to a wider and more enchanted world. There is a quiet irony here. A fever made a person feel trapped inside the body, yet it connected that body to almost everything. The stars, the weather, the household, the village, the church, the economy, the soil, the water, the unseen will of God, and the fragile balance of substances imagined beneath the skin. And as we move deeper into this world, the next question becomes more specific. When the fever did not pass quickly, when the heat lingered and the household began to worry, what exactly did people do to the body itself? And why did some of the treatments meant to restore balance become almost as frightening as the illness? And why did some of the treatments meant to restore balance become almost as frightening as the illness? To answer that question, we need to move closer to the bedside and look not only at the fever itself, but at the hands attempting to treat it. A medieval patient who remained ill for several days entered a more uncertain phase of sickness. The first hopes of a quick recovery began to fade. Family remedies might already have been tried. Herbal drinks may have been consumed. Prayers may have been offered. The patient may have sweated through multiple nights, shivered through repeated chills, and drifted in and out of uneasy sleep. Now attention turned toward intervention. One of the most famous and most misunderstood interventions was bloodletting. Today, the idea sounds alarming. Removing blood from a weakened, feverish person appears counterintuitive, even dangerous. Yet for centuries, bloodletting occupied a respected place in learned medicine across Europe and much of the Mediterranean world. The reasoning behind it was not random. If illness was caused by imbalance, congestion, corruption, or excess within the body, then removing some blood could theoretically relieve pressure, restore harmony, and assist nature's healing process. Medieval physicians often spoke of helping nature rather than defeating disease directly. The body itself was expected to do the healing. Medical treatment aimed to guide that process. The practice could take many forms. A physician or barber surgeon might open a vein in the arm. In other circumstances, different sites were selected depending on the illness being treated. The amount removed varied according to age, condition, season, and medical opinion. Learned texts debated proper timing. Some practitioners consulted astrological charts before deciding when a procedure should occur. This is another point where modern assumptions can be misleading. Astrology in medieval medicine was not usually viewed as magic by educated practitioners. Rather, it was considered part of the natural order. The heavens were believed to influence earthly conditions just as the moon influenced tides. Medical decisions might therefore be connected to planetary movements, zodiac signs, and seasonal cycles. Whether these ideas were effective is a separate question. What matters for understanding the medieval patient is that such treatments often emerged from a coherent worldview. People were not simply enduring arbitrary rituals. They were participating in what many regarded as the best available understanding of how bodies functioned. Even so, the experience could be unsettling. Imagine already feeling weak from days of fever. Your limbs ache. Your mouth is dry. Standing leaves you dizzy. Then someone arrives carrying instruments designed to remove blood from your body. The room becomes quiet. Family members watch carefully. The procedure begins. For some patients, the result appeared beneficial. They felt temporary relief. Perhaps their fever lessened. Perhaps they slept afterward. Perhaps they would have recovered anyway and credited the treatment. For others, the outcome was less encouraging. Excessive blood loss could worsen weakness, particularly in already vulnerable individuals. Yet bloodletting persisted because illness itself was unpredictable. A recovery following treatment reinforced confidence. A death could often be explained as the consequence of a disease already too advanced to cure. In a world without controlled clinical trials, experience accumulated through stories, memory, authority, and reputation. And bloodletting was only one tool. Purging represented another major category of treatment. If harmful substances were believed to be trapped inside the body, then expelling them seemed logical. Laxatives, emetics, and other preparations might be used to encourage evacuation. Again, the goal was balance. Health depended on proper movement and proper proportion. Illness suggested that something had gone wrong within that delicate system. The irony, of course, was that fever often already left patients dehydrated and exhausted. From a modern perspective, some treatments could unintentionally increase suffering. Yet it would be unfair to imagine medieval medicine as nothing more than harmful intervention. Alongside dramatic procedures existed a great deal of practical observation and supportive care. Physicians paid attention to diet. They monitored sleep. They considered environmental conditions. They worried about air quality. They observed symptoms over time. Many medical texts emphasized moderation rather than aggression. Rest, appropriate food, careful nursing, and gradual recovery were frequently recommended. In fact, one of the quieter realities of medieval healthcare is that much healing happened through attentive caregiving rather than spectacular remedies. A patient survived because someone brought water, because someone changed bedding soaked with sweat, because someone remained awake through the night, because someone noticed that breathing had changed, because someone prepared food when appetite finally returned. The labor of care, most often performed by women, rarely occupied the center of learned medical texts. Yet it formed the foundation of survival for countless households. A fever was rarely endured alone. The patient's experience became intertwined with the experience of caregivers. Consider a mother watching over a feverish child. The fever rises after sunset. The child becomes restless. The skin burns beneath the blanket. Hours pass. The mother has no thermometer, no laboratory report, no emergency department to visit. Instead, she relies on observation. Is the child more alert than yesterday? Are they drinking? Is the breathing easier? Are the eyes focused? Has the sweating begun? Every small sign carries enormous weight. Hope rises and falls repeatedly. A slight improvement can transform the mood of an entire household. A sudden setback can undo days of optimism. This emotional rhythm was familiar across medieval society. Illness often unfolded not as a single dramatic event, but as a sequence of uncertain days. Families learned to live inside uncertainty because uncertainty was unavoidable. And nowhere was uncertainty more dangerous than during epidemic outbreaks. When fever appeared in multiple households simultaneously, Individual worry expanded into communal fear. A neighbor falls ill, then another. A household across the lane reports similar symptoms. Soon church attendance begins to thin. Market conversations become cautious. Rumors spread faster than reliable information. The medieval village or town possessed no public health department in the modern sense. Yet communities still attempted to interpret what was happening. People searched for patterns. Was the illness concentrated near a particular well? Did it begin after unusual weather? Had travelers recently arrived? Were animals affected? Had unusual celestial signs appeared? Such questions may seem disconnected from modern medicine, but they reveal a fundamentally human response. When confronted by invisible danger, people seek explanations. The challenge was that many fever-producing diseases behaved differently from one another. Malaria-like fevers in marshy regions often followed recurring patterns. Typhus thrived in crowded conditions where lice spread easily. Waterborne diseases emerged from contaminated supplies. Respiratory infections moved through households during colder seasons. Wound infections followed injury. Childhood diseases circulated among the young. Yet all of these could present, at least initially, with the same unsettling sign, heat. The body became hot, and from that single symptom, people attempted to navigate an enormous landscape of possibilities. Sometimes experience provided genuine insight. Communities noticed that crowded, filthy environments often produced illness. They observed seasonal patterns. They recognized that certain occupations carried particular risks. They understood that exhaustion, poor nutrition, and hardship weakened people. They saw connections even when they lacked modern explanations. This is one reason medieval medicine deserves more nuance than it often receives. Many conclusions were incorrect, but many observations were accurate. The gap lay in understanding causation. A physician might correctly recognize that swampy environments were associated with recurrent fevers while misunderstanding the role of mosquitoes. A town might observe that waste contributed to sickness without understanding microbial contamination. The observations could be valuable even when the explanations were flawed. Meanwhile, fever continued to shape every level of society. Monasteries provide an especially revealing example. Life within a monastery followed routines designed around prayer, labor, study, and communal discipline. Order was highly valued. Days unfolded according to bells and schedules. A fever disrupted that order immediately. A monk unable to attend services created an absence noticeable to everyone. Infirmaries existed precisely because sickness was expected to occur. Medieval monastic communities often developed sophisticated approaches to caring for their ill members compared to many secular environments. The infirmary could be quieter. Food might be improved. Additional rest could be granted. Medical texts might be available. Herbs could be cultivated in monastery gardens. Knowledge accumulated over generations. Yet even here, the limits of medicine remained obvious. The infirmary offered comfort, could not guarantee recovery. A fever severe enough to overwhelm the body remained dangerous whether one lay in a peasant cottage or beneath the care of educated monks. And then there were the towns. By the High Middle Ages, many European towns had become crowded, energetic places filled with commerce, workshops, animals, travelers, and waste. Economic growth brought opportunity. It also brought new health challenges. The medieval town was alive with movement. Carts rolled through narrow streets. Merchants arrived from distant regions. Ships unloaded goods from foreign ports. Pilgrims passed through. Craftsmen worked in close quarters. People lived packed together in ways that created ideal conditions for certain diseases to spread. The irony was striking. Prosperity could increase vulnerability. The very networks that enriched towns also connected them to illnesses originating far beyond local boundaries. A fever appearing in one district might represent a problem that began weeks earlier hundreds of miles away. No one standing beside a sickbed could easily know that. Instead, they encountered only the immediate reality. A person who yesterday seemed healthy now struggles with heat, weakness, and confusion. The source remains hidden. The future remains uncertain. And as medieval physicians, caregivers, priests, and families attempted to understand these recurring waves of illness, they increasingly turned their attention toward a larger question: whether the environment itself, from the air people breathed to the seasons they lived through, might hold clues to why fevers seem to arrive at certain times, disappear at others, and sometimes return with even greater force than before. Whether the environment itself, from the air people breathed to the seasons they lived through, might hold clues to why fevers seem to arrive at certain times, disappear at others, and sometimes return with even greater force than before. To a medieval observer, this was not an abstract question. It was something visible in the rhythm of ordinary life. Certain months acquired reputations. Certain landscapes acquired reputations. Entire regions became associated with particular forms of sickness. Long before anyone understood bacteria, viruses, parasites, or vectors of disease, people noticed that illness did not distribute itself evenly across the world. Fever seemed to prefer some places over others. It visited with greater intensity during particular seasons. It followed patterns that were imperfect but difficult to ignore. A village beside marshland might experience recurring waves of illness that neighboring communities on higher ground escaped. A crowded town could suffer outbreaks after periods of unusual weather. A military encampment might become overwhelmed by fever, while nearby civilians remained relatively unaffected. These observations gradually reinforced the belief that environment mattered. And in some respects, medieval people were correct. They simply interpreted those patterns through a different framework. One of the most influential ideas involved what historians often call miasma theory, though medieval understandings were more varied than the modern label sometimes suggests. Broadly speaking, many people believed that corrupted air could produce disease. Rotting matter, stagnant water, decaying waste, foul odors, and unhealthy environments were thought capable of generating harmful influences that entered the body through breathing. Modern listeners may immediately recognize the limitation. Bad smells do not themselves cause most infectious diseases. Yet there is a subtle irony here. The places medieval people often identified as dangerous frequently were dangerous. Stagnant water could support mosquito populations. Rotting waste could contaminate local environments. Overcrowded districts facilitated disease transmission. Poor sanitation created real health risks. The explanation was flawed, but the instinct to connect sickness with unhealthy surroundings was often grounded in observation. This made environmental management an important part of medieval responses to illness. Town authorities occasionally ordered streets cleaned. Waste removal could become a public concern. Markets might be regulated. Certain trades producing unpleasant smells were sometimes restricted or relocated. These measures were not always successful, and they varied enormously across regions and centuries, but they reveal something important. Medieval societies did not simply accept disease as inevitable. They experimented. They observed. They attempted solutions. Sometimes those solutions worked for reasons they did not understand. Sometimes they failed entirely. Most often, they occupied a complicated middle ground. For individuals suffering from fever, environmental concerns entered the sickroom itself. Fresh air was frequently recommended. Windows might be opened when weather allowed. Certain scents were believed capable of purifying the atmosphere around the patient. Rosewater, rosemary, lavender, juniper, sage, vinegar, and incense all found their way into medical recommendations in various places and periods. A wealthy household could afford imported spices and costly aromatics. A poorer family relied on whatever local plants were available. The goal remained similar: protect the patient from corrupted influences, create an environment favorable to recovery. At the same time, medieval medicine paid close attention to seasonal change. The year itself was understood as a participant in human health. Spring, summer, autumn, and winter were not merely weather patterns. They possessed medical significance. Each season was associated with particular qualities. Spring was often connected with renewal and moisture. Summer brought heat and dryness. Autumn carried concerns about decay and imbalance. Winter introduced cold, damp conditions that affected the body differently. These associations influenced expectations about illness. A fever arising during the heat of summer might be interpreted differently from one emerging during winter. Treatments could vary accordingly. Dietary recommendations shifted with the seasons. So did advice regarding exercise, sleep, bathing, and daily routine. Again, modern medicine would not endorse most of these theories in their original form. Yet they reflected an attempt to understand a genuine reality. Human health does change with environmental conditions. Nutrition fluctuates. Infectious diseases follow seasonal patterns. Temperature affects physical stress. Resources become more or less available throughout the year. Medieval observers were noticing real phenomena even when their explanatory models remained incomplete. And nowhere were seasonal pressures more apparent than during years of scarcity. When harvests failed, fever became far more dangerous. A healthy body possesses reserves. An undernourished body does not. A peasant who entered winter already weakened by poor harvests faced illness under very different conditions than someone enjoying relative abundance. Food shortages reduced resistance. Recovery became slower. Children became especially vulnerable. The elderly suffered more severely. Communities exhausted by famine often discovered that disease followed close behind. Medieval chroniclers repeatedly observed this pattern. Hunger weakened populations. Illness exploited that weakness. Then illness further reduced the labor available to produce food. The cycle could become self-reinforcing. This connection between nutrition and fever was often recognized even without understanding the biological mechanisms involved. Medical writers frequently emphasized appropriate diet during illness. Good food was considered medicine in its own right. The difficulty, of course, was access. A physician might recommend particular foods. The patient still needed a way to obtain them. For wealthy households, this challenge could often be managed. For poorer families, recommendations sometimes existed largely in theory. This created a significant divide in medieval healthcare. Knowledge and resources did not always align. A village healer might understand that a recovering patient needed nourishing food and rest. The household might simply lack enough food to provide it. Economic reality shaped medical outcomes at every level. And this brings us to one of the quieter truths about medieval fever. Many deaths attributed to disease were also connected to poverty. Not because poverty caused every illness directly, but because poverty limited recovery. The body fighting infection requires energy. The body recovering from prolonged fever requires nourishment. The body enduring repeated illnesses benefits from stable shelter, clean water, and consistent food. People who lacked those advantages faced greater risks even when suffering from the same disease. This reality became especially visible during childhood. Children occupied a precarious place in medieval society. They were loved, they were valued, but they were also vulnerable in ways modern audiences sometimes underestimate. Infant and childhood mortality rates remained high throughout much of the medieval period. Many diseases that modern medicine now treats successfully carried significant dangers. Fevers were among the most common signs that something had gone wrong. For parents, a child's fever could be terrifying precisely because children changed so quickly. A child playing energetically one day might be bedridden the next. The speed of deterioration could seem shocking. Parents watched carefully for signs of improvement. They measured recovery not through instruments but through behavior. Was the child asking for food? Were they speaking clearly? Did they want to sit up? Did they recognize familiar faces? Small moments carried enormous emotional weight. A child requesting bread after days of illness might bring tremendous relief. A return of laughter could feel miraculous. Recovery often unfolded gradually. Strength returned in stages. Families learned patience because there was little alternative. Yet childhood illness also shaped broader cultural attitudes. Many medieval people lived with the memory of siblings, cousins, friends, or children lost to disease. This familiarity with mortality did not make grief easier. If anything, it often deepened the emotional significance of survival. Every recovered child represented a future reclaimed. Every illness overcome became part of family history. Stories of dangerous fevers frequently survived long after the patient recovered. People remembered. They recalled the nights of worry, the remedies used, the prayers offered, the moment improvement finally arrived. These memories became part of community knowledge. And community knowledge mattered enormously in a world where professional medical assistance remained limited. Most healthcare occurred outside universities, outside hospitals, outside formal institutions. It happened in kitchens, workshops, farms, monasteries, and village homes. Knowledge circulated through conversation. Mothers taught daughters. Neighbors exchanged remedies. Travelers shared observations. Monastic texts preserved treatments. Physicians recorded cases. A vast network of practical experience developed alongside learned medicine. Sometimes these traditions overlapped. Sometimes they competed. A university-trained physician might dismiss certain local remedies. A village healer might distrust elite medical theories. Yet patients often moved between both worlds. They were willing to try whatever seemed helpful. This flexibility reflected necessity. When facing prolonged fever, certainty was a luxury few possessed. Even physicians disagreed. Medical texts revealed debates over diagnosis, treatment, and theory. Different authorities emphasized different approaches. Different regions developed distinct traditions. Medicine, like every other field of medieval life, evolved over time. There was no single medieval answer to illness. Instead, there were countless local variations shaped by geography, culture, religion, economics, and experience. And then there was travel. Travel introduced another layer of complexity. Merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, sailors, diplomats, students, and laborers moved between regions carrying not only goods and ideas but also diseases. A fever encountered on the road could feel especially threatening. The traveler was removed from familiar support networks. Local remedies might be unavailable. Language barriers could complicate communication. Strangers had to decide whether to offer assistance. Roadside hospitals and religious institutions sometimes provided care, but conditions varied enormously. A traveler struck by fever faced both physical weakness and social uncertainty. The medieval road could become a lonely place. Yet travel also spread medical knowledge. Treatments migrated across borders. Arabic medical scholarship entered Europe through translation movements. Greek texts were rediscovered and studied. Herbal knowledge crossed regions. Universities absorbed and transmitted ideas. Medical understanding remained imperfect, but it was not stagnant. The medieval world was constantly exchanging information. This exchange becomes particularly visible when examining the rise of medical learning during the High Middle Ages. Universities emerged as important centers of intellectual life. Students studied medicine alongside theology, law, and philosophy. Texts were copied, debated, and expanded. Physicians increasingly attempted to systematize observations about disease. Fevers received extensive attention, not because they represented a single illness, but because they represented one of the most common and important signs of bodily distress. Medical writers classified fevers, categorized them, described their symptoms, attempted to distinguish one form from another. This effort reveals something deeply human. People wanted clarity. They wanted patterns. They wanted predictive power. If a physician could identify the type of fever, perhaps the likely outcome could also be known. Perhaps treatment could become more precise. Perhaps uncertainty could be reduced. The challenge was that fever remained frustratingly elusive. Two patients might appear similar yet experience radically different outcomes. One recovered quickly. Another deteriorated. One survived despite severe symptoms. Another died despite receiving comparable care. The body remained unpredictable. And that unpredictability continued to shape medieval attitudes toward illness, healing, and fate itself. For many people, a fever was not simply a medical event. It became a confrontation with uncertainty on every level: physical, emotional, social, economic, and spiritual. The patient lay in bed wondering whether strength would return. Family members wondered whether they would see recovery or loss. Physicians wondered whether their understanding was sufficient. Priests wondered how suffering fit within divine order. Communities wondered whether isolated illness signaled something larger approaching. And sometimes, as the centuries passed, those fears proved justified. Because there were moments when the familiar fevers of ordinary life were suddenly overshadowed by outbreaks so vast, so disruptive, and so terrifying that entire populations began to realize they were facing something far beyond the illnesses they thought they knew. A realization that would become increasingly difficult to ignore as Europe moved toward some of the most devastating epidemic crises in its history. The realization that would become increasingly difficult to ignore as Europe moved toward some of the most devastating epidemic crises in its history. Yet before those larger catastrophes arrived, it is worth pausing for a moment in an ordinary medieval community, because this is where most people encountered fever most of the time. Not during continent-shaking epidemics, not during famous disasters recorded in chronicles, but during the quiet interruptions of daily life. A farmer becomes ill in late summer. A baker develops a persistent heat after weeks of exhausting labor. A child grows feverish during winter. A monk misses morning prayers because he can no longer rise from his bed. These individual experiences formed the background against which larger epidemics would later be understood. And that background shaped expectations. One reason major outbreaks proved so frightening was that people already knew fever intimately. They had seen it before. They had watched relatives endure it. They understood that illness could be dangerous. But they also expected familiar patterns. Most fevers, even severe ones, existed within a range of experiences people thought they recognized. Then occasionally something happened that did not fit. A sickness moved too quickly. Too many people fell ill at once. Usual remedies seemed ineffective. Recovery rates dropped. The familiar became unfamiliar. And that transition from the known to the unknown was often the most terrifying part. Imagine a medieval town in the early 14th century. The streets are busy. Market stalls open at dawn. Bells ring from parish churches. Craftsmen begin work. Merchants negotiate prices. Children weave between adults carrying baskets. tools, and bundles of cloth. On the surface, life appears ordinary. Yet beneath that appearance lies a constant awareness of vulnerability. People have lived through hard winters. They remember poor harvests. They have witnessed outbreaks of disease before. Most families carry memories of loss. The medieval world is resilient, but it is not secure. Security, in fact, is one of the great illusions modern audiences often project backward onto history. When we look at medieval towns today through surviving cathedrals, castles, and manuscripts, it is easy to focus on permanence. Stone buildings create an impression of stability, but daily life was often far more fragile than those structures suggest. A serious fever could still threaten a household's survival. A failed harvest could still alter an entire year's prospects. A local outbreak could still transform community life. This fragility influenced how people thought about health. Medieval individuals paid attention to signs, not because they were unusually superstitious, but because uncertainty encouraged observation. Changes in weather were noticed. Animal behavior was noticed. Unusual deaths were noticed. Patterns of illness were noticed. Today, we often rely on institutions to monitor risk for us. Meteorologists watch storms. Public health agencies track outbreaks. Scientists analyze trends. Medieval communities performed many of these functions informally through collective observation. Information traveled through conversation. Someone heard that neighboring villages were experiencing sickness. Someone reported unusual mortality among livestock. A traveler brought news from another region. A merchant described conditions in a distant town. Knowledge moved slowly compared to modern standards, but it moved nonetheless. And with that knowledge came anticipation. Sometimes fear arrived before disease itself. Rumors of illness could alter behavior. Travel plans might change. Markets might become quieter. Religious services might attract larger crowds as people sought reassurance. People began preparing psychologically for dangers not yet visible. This emotional landscape becomes especially important when we consider how medieval societies understood causation. Modern medicine tends to separate biological explanation from moral meaning. Disease has causes. Human behavior has causes. These categories are related but distinct. Medieval people often perceived a closer connection. This does not mean they believed every illness represented divine punishment. That popular stereotype oversimplifies a much more complex reality. Rather, many medieval individuals lived within a worldview where natural events and spiritual meaning could coexist. A fever could emerge from natural causes and still prompt spiritual reflection. An epidemic could have environmental explanations and religious significance simultaneously. These ideas were not necessarily contradictory within medieval thought. A poor harvest, for example, could result from weather conditions while also encouraging questions about human conduct and divine order. Similarly, illness could inspire practical medical responses alongside religious responses. This dual framework shaped how people endured suffering. A patient fighting fever did not merely ask, "What is happening to my body?" They might also ask, "Why is this happening now?" That second question often extended beyond medicine. And because it extended beyond medicine, fever became intertwined with broader questions about fate, justice, and human vulnerability. We can see this particularly clearly in medieval writings. Chronicles, letters, sermons, medical texts, and personal accounts often reveal people struggling to make sense of suffering without reducing it to a single explanation. Some emphasized environmental conditions. Others highlighted spiritual lessons. Many combined both. This intellectual flexibility sometimes surprises modern readers. We often expect historical people to fit neatly into categories: scientific or religious, practical or spiritual, rational or superstitious. Real human beings rarely divide themselves so cleanly. Medieval people were no exception. A physician might carefully observe symptoms while believing planetary influences mattered. A priest might encourage prayer while recommending practical care. A parent might administer herbal remedies while making vows to a saint. These overlapping responses reflected the complexity of lived experience. And fever itself encouraged complexity because it resisted easy answers. Even among educated physicians, fever remained a puzzle. Medical texts devoted enormous attention to classification. Different kinds of fevers were identified. Different durations were noted. Different symptom patterns were described. Some fevers appeared intermittent. Others remained continuous. Some seemed linked to specific organs. Others appeared more generalized. The effort to categorize illness reveals an important truth. Medieval medicine was not static. Physicians observed, compared cases, recorded outcomes, debated theories. The process was imperfect, but it was genuine. Knowledge evolved through experience. In universities such as those emerging in places like Bologna, Paris, Montpellier, and Oxford, students encountered increasingly sophisticated medical traditions. Ancient authorities remained influential, but they were not merely copied without thought. Commentaries expanded upon earlier works. New observations entered circulation. Physicians attempted to reconcile theory with practice, and practice often forced uncomfortable questions. Why did similar patients experience different outcomes? Why did treatments succeed in one case and fail in another? Why did entire communities sometimes become ill simultaneously? These questions accumulated across generations. Not all received satisfying answers, but the effort to answer them continued. Meanwhile, outside universities, practical healers faced the same mysteries in more immediate ways. A village healer did not have the luxury of abstract debate when a feverish child lay before them. They relied on experience, memory, observation, local knowledge, and local knowledge could be remarkably detailed. Communities learned which herbs seemed useful, which water sources appeared safer, which seasons carried particular dangers, which households repeatedly suffered illness. Such knowledge rarely appeared in formal medical treatises, yet it shaped countless decisions. The history of fever is therefore also a history of accumulated observation. Not scientific observation in the modern sense, but observation nonetheless. People watched, they remembered, they adapted, and adaptation became increasingly important as medieval populations grew. By the 13th and early 14th centuries, many regions of Europe experienced demographic expansion. More people occupied more land. Towns grew larger. Trade networks expanded. Travel increased. These developments brought undeniable benefits. Economic activity flourished. Markets connected distant regions. Ideas circulated more rapidly. Urban life became more vibrant, yet growth carried hidden costs. Dense populations created new opportunities for disease transmission. Long-distance trade connected communities previously separated by geography. Ships moved not only goods but also pathogens. Roads linked populations in ways earlier generations had never experienced. The medieval world became more interconnected. Interconnection produced prosperity. It also produced vulnerability. A sickness emerging in one location could travel farther than before. Most people did not yet understand the mechanisms involved. They simply observed the results. Illness seemed increasingly capable of crossing boundaries. This created a subtle shift in perception. Disease no longer appeared solely local. It became regional, sometimes international. News of outbreaks traveled ahead of the illnesses themselves. Reports arrived from distant cities. Merchants described strange conditions elsewhere. Pilgrims carried stories across kingdoms. The sense of living within a larger connected world gradually strengthened. And with that awareness came a new scale of anxiety. A fever was no longer just something that happened to individuals. It could happen to communities, entire regions, even nations. The emotional consequences were profound. For centuries, medieval Europeans had developed ways of coping with ordinary illness. They possessed remedies, customs, religious frameworks, family traditions, community support systems. These tools helped people navigate familiar suffering. But what happened when suffering ceased to be familiar? What happened when the number of sick overwhelmed normal expectations? What happened when fever appeared not in one household, but in dozens? Not in dozens, but in hundreds. Not in hundreds, but seemingly everywhere. The answers to those questions would emerge gradually rather than all at once. At first, there were only scattered warnings, reports from distant places, accounts that sounded alarming but perhaps exaggerated, merchants returning with troubling stories, travelers describing unusual mortality, whispers that certain ports were experiencing conditions unlike anything people could remember. Most listeners probably treated such reports the way people often treat distant disasters, with concern, with curiosity, and with the quiet assumption that whatever was happening elsewhere would remain elsewhere. History repeatedly demonstrates how comforting that assumption can be, and how often it proves wrong. Because while ordinary households continued tending gardens, harvesting grain, repairing roofs, arranging marriages, baptizing children, and caring for occasional fevers as they always had, larger forces were already moving across trade routes and sea lanes. Invisible forces, unseen by merchants loading cargo, unseen by sailors crossing open water, unseen by travelers entering crowded gates, yet carried with them all the same. And in the years ahead, those forces would begin arriving in communities that had spent generations learning how to manage familiar illnesses, only to discover that familiarity offered far less protection against a new scale of epidemic disease than anyone had hoped, a realization that would first emerge in scattered reports from the edges of the known world before drawing steadily closer to the towns and villages where ordinary medieval families still believed they understood what a fever was. A realization that would first emerge in scattered reports from the edges of the known world before drawing steadily closer to the towns and villages where ordinary medieval families still believed they understood what a fever was. For most people, those first reports would have seemed distant enough to ignore. Medieval life was intensely local. Even though trade networks connected continents, the average villager's world remained relatively small. News traveled, but it traveled slowly. Information arrived filtered through merchants, clergy, travelers, officials, and rumor. By the time a report crossed hundreds of miles, it often carried uncertainty along with it. Somewhere beyond the horizon, people were said to be dying. Somewhere in another port, another kingdom, another trading center, a strange sickness had appeared. Such stories were hardly unusual. Medieval communities heard reports of wars they would never see, famines they would never experience, and disasters they would never witness. Most distant events remained distant, yet occasionally distance proved temporary. One of the most important realities of medieval Europe was that it was far more connected than many modern people imagine. Pilgrims crossed vast regions. Merchants linked cities separated by mountains and seas. Students traveled between universities. Clergy moved through ecclesiastical networks that stretched across kingdoms. Armies marched. Ships sailed. Caravans advanced along established routes. These movements carried wealth, knowledge, culture, and opportunity. They also carried disease. To understand what it was like to live through a medieval fever, we eventually have to confront a difficult truth. The fever that frightened a single household and the epidemic that frightened an entire continent were not separate experiences. They existed on the same spectrum. The difference lay in scale. A family could care for one sick relative. A village could sometimes support several sick households. But when illness multiplied beyond familiar limits, the social systems designed to provide care began to strain. Before reaching that point, however, we should linger with the ordinary people who stood unknowingly on the edge of change. Imagine a merchant arriving at a bustling port town sometime in the early 14th century. The harbor is alive with activity. Crates are unloaded. Ropes creak. Dockworkers shout instructions. Livestock moves through narrow spaces between warehouses. Goods from distant regions exchange hands. The merchant brings valuable cargo, but he also brings something else: information. Travelers were among the most important carriers of news in the medieval world. At inns, markets, monasteries, and ports, stories circulated constantly. Some reports concerned politics. Others concerned prices. Others concerned weather, warfare, or religion. Increasingly, some concerned sickness. A city experiencing unusual mortality became a topic of conversation. A region suffering widespread illness attracted attention. At first, listeners may have responded with curiosity more than fear. Disease elsewhere remained an abstraction. People listened, shook their heads, perhaps offered prayers, and returned to daily concerns. The harvest still needed attention. The roof still needed repair. The taxes still needed paying. Life continued. Yet beneath this ordinary continuity lay a growing vulnerability created by interconnected trade. The same roads that delivered grain during shortages could also deliver infection. The same ships that carried spices and textiles could carry rats, fleas, contaminated goods, or infected travelers. No one understood these mechanisms. The people unloading cargo at a dock had no way of knowing which dangers might accompany a shipment. Their attention focused on visible risks: storms, pirates, spoilage. The invisible risks remained hidden, and hidden dangers are often the most difficult to prepare for. This was especially true in an age when disease remained largely mysterious. Medical knowledge had advanced considerably compared to earlier centuries. Universities produced trained physicians. Medical texts circulated. Observations accumulated. Yet the fundamental causes of many diseases remained unknown. When fever appeared, people observed symptoms rather than microbes. They saw effects rather than causes. And effects can sometimes be deceptive. A fever resulting from contaminated water might look similar to one resulting from a respiratory infection. A fever carried by insects might resemble one arising from entirely different conditions. The body often communicated distress through a limited vocabulary: heat, weakness, pain, swelling, coughing, delirium, exhaustion. Interpreting that vocabulary accurately remained extraordinarily difficult. This uncertainty shaped emotional responses to illness. Today, a diagnosis often provides a degree of reassurance even when treatment remains challenging. Knowing what something is creates a sense of orientation. Medieval patients rarely enjoyed that certainty. A fever could be many things. Some possibilities were relatively mild. Others were deadly. The early stages often looked similar. This meant every fever carried an element of suspense. Every illness began as a question: would this pass in a few days? Would it worsen? Would it spread? Would others become sick? No one knew. Families learned to live with unanswered questions. That emotional skill, living with uncertainty, was one of the defining experiences of medieval health. We can see it clearly in surviving accounts of illness. Letters, chronicles, and religious writings often reveal people waiting for symptoms to improve, waiting for physicians to arrive, waiting for signs of recovery, waiting for news about other sick family members. The passage of time became deeply significant. One more day survived could inspire hope. One difficult night could reverse it. Illness unfolded through observation, and observation encouraged interpretation. A patient who began sweating heavily might be viewed optimistically. A return of appetite seemed promising. Clearer speech suggested improvement. Yet even these signs could mislead. Recoveries sometimes reversed unexpectedly. Declines sometimes stabilized. The body remained capable of surprise. This unpredictability affected physicians as much as patients. Medieval doctors developed prognostic traditions intended to estimate outcomes. They studied symptom patterns. They observed pulse, urine, breathing, appetite, and behavior. They sought clues indicating whether recovery was likely. Some predictions proved accurate. Others did not. The desire to foresee the course of illness reflects something universal. Human beings do not merely want treatment. They want certainty. Often the second desire proves harder to satisfy than the first. And nowhere was certainty more elusive than during widespread outbreaks. When large numbers of people became ill simultaneously, familiar methods of observation grew less reliable. Patterns changed. Expected outcomes shifted. Resources became strained. The normal rhythms of care began to falter. A household accustomed to supporting one feverish relative might suddenly face several. A healer accustomed to visiting a few patients could find requests multiplying. Religious institutions that normally provided assistance could become overwhelmed. Communities discovered that disease was not merely a medical problem. It was also a logistical problem, a social problem, an economic problem, a psychological problem. Fever revealed these connections with particular clarity. Consider food. An individual illness affected one person's ability to work. A widespread outbreak affected many workers at once. Fields went untended. Deliveries slowed. Markets functioned less efficiently. Labor shortages emerged. The consequences extended beyond healthcare. Similarly, caregiving became more difficult. When one person fell ill, healthy relatives could assist. When many people became sick simultaneously, caregivers themselves might become patients. The support system weakened precisely when demand increased. This dynamic would become critically important in later epidemic crises. But even before major epidemics, medieval communities occasionally encountered smaller outbreaks that revealed these vulnerabilities. A monastery might experience illness among multiple monks. A town district might suffer unusually high sickness rates. A military camp might become incapacitated by disease. Such events served as warnings. They demonstrated how quickly normal life could be disrupted. Yet warnings are easier to recognize in retrospect than in the moment. Most people experiencing these episodes likely viewed them as unfortunate but temporary disruptions. Life eventually returned to normal. The market reopened. The harvest resumed. Religious services continued. Children returned to play. People recovered. Communities adapted. The medieval world had endured disease before. There was little reason to assume the future would be fundamentally different. And for long periods that assumption seemed reasonable. Generations passed. Illness remained common. Death remained familiar. But society continued functioning. People married, worked, traveled, prayed, built, traded, learned. The persistence of ordinary life is one of the most remarkable aspects of medieval history. Despite hardship, communities displayed extraordinary resilience. They adjusted repeatedly to challenges that might appear overwhelming from a modern perspective. This resilience can sometimes obscure how frightening fever remained on an individual level. Even in relatively stable periods, becoming seriously ill meant confronting profound vulnerability. A healthy medieval person relied heavily on physical labor. Whether farming, crafting, carrying goods, serving households, or performing religious duties, the body remained central to daily survival. Fever threatened that foundation directly. Strength disappeared. Endurance vanished. Ordinary tasks became impossible. The body transformed from a tool into an obstacle. Few experiences felt more unsettling, particularly because recovery timelines remained uncertain. Person might improve rapidly, or remain weak for weeks, or suffer recurring illness, or experience complications. The future narrowed to immediate concerns. Can I stand today? Can I eat? Can I work? Will the fever return tonight? These questions occupied countless medieval minds. Most never entered historical records. They unfolded quietly in cottages, workshops, monasteries, inns, and townhouses across Europe. Yet together they formed one of the most common human experiences of the age. The history of fever is therefore not primarily the history of famous epidemics. It is the history of millions of ordinary encounters with illness. The epidemics matter because they magnified those encounters. They exposed underlying realities already present in daily life. And one of those realities involved the limits of knowledge. For all their observations, classifications, remedies, and theories, medieval people remained separated from the true causes of many diseases. They were intelligent observers working without critical pieces of information. This created a fascinating paradox. The more carefully physicians studied fever, the more they realized how complex it was. Simple explanations rarely captured the full picture. Different patients behaved differently. Different environments produced different patterns. Different outbreaks followed different trajectories. Knowledge expanded. Mystery persisted. By the early 14th century, Europe possessed more medical learning than it had in many earlier periods. Universities flourished. Texts circulated. Practitioners accumulated experience. Yet just beyond the horizon, forces were already moving through interconnected trade networks that would challenge every existing assumption about disease, care, mortality, and the very meaning of living through a fever. The first signs were subtle. A troubling report here, an unusual mortality there, a port experiencing strange conditions, a trading center sending alarming news. Most people still continued with ordinary routines, unaware that some of the stories arriving from distant regions were not merely reports of another local outbreak, but the earliest warnings of a crisis that was steadily advancing along the roads, sea lanes, and commercial routes linking the medieval world together. A crisis that was steadily advancing along the roads, sea lanes, and commercial routes linking the medieval world together. If we could stand in a European port city during those years and observe the scene without the benefit of hindsight, nothing would immediately appear extraordinary. Ships still arrived. Church bells still marked the hours. Merchants still argued over prices. Fishermen still repaired nets. Children still ran through narrow streets. Life possessed the same mixture of routine and uncertainty that had characterized medieval society for centuries. Yet this apparent normality concealed one of history's most persistent truths. Transformative events rarely announce themselves clearly at the beginning. People living through change almost never recognize its full significance immediately. Instead, they encounter fragments, a troubling rumor, an unusual death, an unexpected delay in trade, a traveler describing conditions that sound difficult to believe. Only later do these fragments arrange themselves into a recognizable pattern. This was especially true when it came to disease. For generations, medieval communities had developed expectations about illness. They understood what ordinary fevers looked like. They knew how seasonal sickness behaved. They possessed cultural frameworks for interpreting outbreaks. The problem was that those frameworks depended on scale. A village could make sense of 10 sick people. A town could make sense of 50, even 100. But there came a point at which familiar explanations began to strain under the weight of events. Long before that point arrived, however, there were signs. Many of them emerged through trade. Trade was one of the great achievements of the medieval world. It connected distant regions in ways that enriched daily life. Salt, grain, wine, cloth, timber, metal, spices, manuscripts, and countless other goods moved across enormous distances. Entire communities depended on these networks. Yet trade routes were more than economic pathways. They were human pathways. And wherever people moved, disease moved with them. The medieval world did not possess the concept of asymptomatic transmission. It did not understand incubation periods. It did not recognize microscopic organisms. But people certainly observed that travelers sometimes appeared healthy when they arrived and ill shortly afterward. They noticed that outbreaks often seemed connected to movement. The challenge lay in understanding exactly how. Consider a merchant vessel entering a Mediterranean harbor. The crew may appear exhausted but functional. Cargo is unloaded. Business begins. Conversations occur. Goods enter warehouses. People disperse throughout the city. Nothing about this process necessarily appears dangerous. Yet, if disease has accompanied that vessel, its effects may not become visible immediately. Days pass. Then perhaps someone falls ill. At first, this attracts little attention. Illness is common. A single fever rarely causes alarm. Then another person becomes sick. Then another. The pattern remains unclear. No one yet knows whether these cases are connected. This ambiguity is crucial to understanding medieval experiences of epidemic disease. History often compresses events. When we read about major outbreaks, they can appear to unfold with startling speed. Entire cities seem to become sick overnight. Populations appear to collapse almost instantly. The lived reality was usually more gradual. Not because disease spread slowly, but because recognition spread slowly. People needed time to understand what they were seeing. At first, symptoms looked familiar. Fever, weakness, pain, perhaps swelling, perhaps coughing, perhaps delirium. The individual components resembled illnesses people already knew. The difference emerged only when patterns accumulated. And by the time patterns become obvious, events are often already well underway. This delayed recognition affected every level of society. Physicians initially approached unusual outbreaks using established knowledge. Why wouldn't they? Their previous experience had taught them that most illnesses fit recognizable categories. The same was true for religious authorities, civic leaders, and ordinary households. People interpreted new events through old frameworks because old frameworks were what they possessed. Sometimes this worked remarkably well. At other times, reality proved more complicated. One of the fascinating aspects of medieval medicine is how frequently practitioners encountered situations that challenged existing theories. Medical texts reveal repeated efforts to refine understanding. Observations were recorded. Exceptions were noted. Unusual cases attracted attention. Knowledge evolved through confrontation with reality. Yet reality occasionally moved faster than theory. And disease was particularly capable of exposing that gap. Imagine being a physician in a prosperous medieval city. You have studied respected authorities. You understand humoral medicine. You possess practical experience treating patients. You have seen fevers before, many fevers. Then a new outbreak begins. At first, it resembles familiar illnesses, but something feels different. The number of cases increases unexpectedly. Symptoms seem unusually severe. Patients deteriorate more rapidly than expected. Treatments that sometimes helped before now appear less effective. What do you conclude? The answer was rarely immediate. Most physicians attempted to interpret new conditions using existing concepts. They examined environmental factors, weather patterns, food supplies, air quality, astronomical conditions, population health. These investigations reflected genuine intellectual effort. People were trying to understand. What makes medieval epidemic history so compelling is not ignorance but observation. Observers noticed far more than they are often credited for. They recognized clustering. They recognized transmission patterns, even if imperfectly. They recognized environmental influences. They recognized social consequences. The problem was not a lack of attention. The problem was a lack of critical information. Without microbiology, disease remained partially hidden. Its effects were visible. Its mechanisms were not. And when mechanisms remain invisible, interpretation becomes extraordinarily difficult. This uncertainty affected emotional responses as much as medical ones. Fear rarely emerges from danger alone. Fear emerges from uncertainty about danger. A known risk can often be managed psychologically. An unknown risk is harder to contain. Fever occupied a peculiar position in medieval life because it belonged to both categories simultaneously. People knew fever. They had lived with it for generations. Yet each individual fever remained uncertain. Would it pass? Would it worsen? Would it spread? The familiar symptom concealed an unfamiliar future. During periods of widespread disease, this uncertainty multiplied dramatically. A household might find itself asking questions no previous generation had needed to ask at such scale. Why are so many people becoming ill? Why is this outbreak different? Why are recoveries becoming less common? Why do familiar remedies seem inadequate? These questions carried practical consequences. Households adjusted behavior. Communities reconsidered routines. Authorities searched for explanations. Religious responses intensified. Medical responses evolved. The search for understanding became almost as important as the search for treatment. This search often led people toward environmental explanations. Weather attracted particular attention. Extreme heat, unusual rainfall, persistent dampness, failed seasons, all were examined for clues. The medieval mind did not sharply separate human health from environmental conditions. The relationship seemed obvious. Crops responded to weather. Animals responded to weather. Why should people be different? In many respects, this reasoning contained an element of truth. Environmental conditions do influence disease. Modern epidemiology recognizes numerous connections between climate, ecology, nutrition, and illness. Medieval observers simply lacked the tools to identify specific mechanisms. So they worked with broader patterns. And broad patterns sometimes produced surprisingly accurate observations. For example, people often noticed that disease thrived where populations were crowded and resources strained. They recognized the relationship even if they interpreted it differently than modern science would. Likewise, they understood that famine and illness frequently appeared together. Again, the mechanisms were only partially understood. The observation itself was sound. This combination of perceptive observation and incomplete explanation characterizes much of medieval medicine. It is one reason simplistic portrayals are misleading. The world of medieval healthcare was neither wholly irrational nor fully scientific by modern standards. It occupied a complicated middle ground. People observed carefully. They reasoned sincerely. They sometimes reached incorrect conclusions. But they were usually attempting to answer real questions. questions that became increasingly urgent as disease expanded beyond ordinary expectations. Meanwhile, ordinary people continued navigating daily life. A baker still had bread to prepare. A farmer still had fields to manage. A merchant still had goods to transport. The persistence of routine deserves attention because it shaped how outbreaks unfolded. People could not simply stop living. Economic survival required activity. Food required labor. Trade required movement. Religious obligations required gathering. Even when illness appeared, many essential functions continued. This created opportunities for disease to circulate, not because people behaved recklessly, because alternatives were limited. A medieval laborer could not work remotely. A farmer could not postpone harvest indefinitely. Communities operated under constraints that modern audiences sometimes underestimate. Those constraints influence decisions, and decisions made under constraint often appear different when viewed centuries later. One of the recurring themes in the history of fever is the tension between necessity and risk. People frequently understood that certain activities might expose them to danger. Yet necessity compelled those activities anyway. Water had to be fetched. Markets had to operate. Travel had to occur. Caregivers had to approach the sick. Avoiding all risk was impossible. The medieval world functioned because people accepted vulnerability as part of life. This acceptance did not eliminate fear. Far from it. Medieval people feared disease deeply, but fear coexisted with practicality. Life continued because it had to continue, and it was precisely this continuation, the steady movement of goods, people, animals, and information, that allowed larger outbreaks to travel farther than anyone realized. By the time many communities understood they were facing something unusual, connections had already been established. Routes had already been traveled. Ships had already docked. Visitors had already arrived. The chain was already in motion, yet even then, recognition remained uneven. Some communities dismissed warnings. Others reacted strongly. Some authorities attempted preventative measures. Others hesitated. Human responses varied just as they always do. And beneath all these responses remained the same fundamental experience that had defined fever for centuries. Uncertainty. No one knew exactly what would happen next. Not the physician examining patients. Not the priest hearing confessions. Not the merchant listening to rumors from distant ports. Not the mother sitting beside a feverish child. The future remained obscured. People observed what they could, interpreted what they saw, made decisions using incomplete information, and waited. Waiting may be one of the most overlooked aspects of historical illness. So much of the experience involved waiting for symptoms to change, waiting for news, waiting for recovery, waiting for understanding. In that sense, medieval fever was not merely a medical condition. It was a state of suspended certainty, a period during which ordinary assumptions became unstable. And as reports continued arriving from distant trading centers, as unusual mortality appeared in more locations, and as observers struggled to determine whether these events represented isolated misfortunes or something larger, the medieval world found itself entering one of those long moments of uncertainty that only later generations would recognize as the opening stages of a profound historical transformation. For now, however, most people could still believe that whatever troubling news circulated beyond the horizon would remain beyond the horizon, even as merchants, sailors, pilgrims, and travelers continued carrying stories from one region to another, and those stories began sounding increasingly similar no matter which road, port, or market they seemed to come from. Those stories began sounding increasingly similar no matter which road, port, or market they seemed to come from. At first, the similarities were subtle. A merchant arriving from the eastern Mediterranean spoke of unusual mortality in a trading city. Weeks later, another traveler described comparable conditions somewhere else. Then a sailor mentioned abandoned houses in a port farther along the coast. None of these reports, taken individually, necessarily pointed toward a larger pattern. Medieval people were accustomed to hearing news of local disasters. Illness, after all, was never entirely absent from daily life. But repetition has a way of changing perception. The more often a story is heard, the more difficult it becomes to dismiss. In taverns, monasteries, marketplaces, and town squares, conversations began circling around familiar themes. There were accounts of fevers that progressed with unusual speed. Stories of entire households becoming ill within a remarkably short period. Reports that some communities seemed unable to care for all their sick. Descriptions of symptoms that sounded familiar in one moment and strangely unfamiliar in the next. Most listeners still had little reason to panic. Distance remained psychologically reassuring. Human beings tend to place a comforting boundary between themselves and danger when that danger appears far away. The medieval world was no different. A troubling event occurring hundreds of miles away could still feel almost abstract. The challenge was that trade networks ignored psychological boundaries. A caravan did not stop because a community wished a threat would remain distant. A ship did not turn back because a town felt unprepared. Movement continued, and movement connected places that often seemed isolated. To understand how unsettling this gradual realization could be, it helps to imagine the perspective of an ordinary townsperson, perhaps a cloth merchant living in a prosperous commercial center. He hears rumors from visiting traders. They speak of sickness in another region. He listens politely. The information is interesting, perhaps even concerning, but hardly life-changing. Weeks later, another merchant arrives carrying a similar story. Then another. The reports are not identical, but they share a certain shape. Unusual fever, unexpected mortality, communities struggling to understand what is happening. The merchant begins paying closer attention. Not because he fully understands the danger, but because the pattern feels increasingly difficult to ignore. This process of recognition occurred unevenly across Europe. Some regions received information quickly because they sat at the center of major trade routes. Others remained relatively insulated. Some communities possessed strong connections to distant markets. Others depended primarily on local exchange. Yet, eventually, information traveled almost everywhere. And information, even imperfect information, changes behavior. People became more attentive to news, more interested in reports from travelers, more likely to ask questions. Had anyone else heard similar stories? Did the details match? Was the situation improving or worsening? No one possessed a complete picture. The picture emerged slowly through fragments. This is one reason medieval outbreaks often felt so bewildering. Modern societies usually receive centralized information during crises. News organizations, governments, scientists, and public institutions generate continuous updates. The medieval world lacked such systems. Knowledge remained decentralized, partial, inconsistent, sometimes contradictory. One traveler claimed conditions were improving. Another insisted they were deteriorating. One report emphasized fever. Another described swelling. Another focused on sudden death. Trying to understand events through these fragments required interpretation. And interpretation was shaped by previous experience. Most people initially compared new reports to familiar illnesses. That was a reasonable response. Human beings naturally understand new experiences through existing frameworks. The difficulty arises when the new experience exceeds the framework. A fever that behaves differently from known fevers challenges assumptions. An outbreak larger than previous outbreaks challenges expectations. Gradually, communities began encountering exactly those challenges. Yet before examining the larger social consequences, it is worth returning once more to the experience of the sick individual. Because even during periods of widespread disease, illness was always encountered personally. Statistics did not exist for most medieval people. Population-level mortality rates meant nothing inside a dark room where someone struggled to breathe. History can sometimes make epidemics feel impersonal. Thousands died, tens of thousands, millions. But every one of those numbers represented an individual experience. Someone waking with a headache, someone feeling an unexpected chill, someone realizing they lacked the strength to stand, someone wondering whether the fever would pass. The experience began the same way it always had. A symptom, a sensation, a subtle awareness that something was wrong. Imagine a woman in a market town. The previous day had been ordinary. She worked, spoke with neighbors, prepared food, completed countless small tasks that filled medieval life. Now she wakes feeling strangely exhausted. Perhaps she blames poor sleep. Perhaps she assumes the feeling will pass. Yet as the day progresses, weakness deepens. Heat builds beneath the skin. A headache develops. The familiar signs of fever emerge. At first, she may not think of herself as seriously ill. That is another important detail often overlooked. People do not instantly recognize the significance of symptoms. Illness unfolds gradually. Recognition follows. A person continues working despite discomfort, delays seeking help, assumes improvement will come tomorrow. Only later does concern begin to grow. This delay occurred throughout history. It remains familiar even today. The difference is that medieval people possessed fewer ways to clarify uncertainty. No thermometer, no blood test, no physician available at a moment's notice. The body itself provided the primary evidence, and the body could be difficult to interpret. As the fever intensified, family members began observing. Questions emerged. How long had the symptoms lasted? Were they worsening? Was anyone else becoming sick? Had there been contact with recent travelers? Had similar illnesses appeared nearby? These questions became increasingly common as reports of unusual outbreaks circulated. Ordinary fevers were concerning. Potentially connected fevers carried additional anxiety. Yet uncertainty persisted. One of the most psychologically difficult aspects of medieval illness was the absence of clear boundaries. Where did an ordinary fever end and a dangerous one begin? When should concern become alarm? When should a priest be called? When should a physician be consulted? The answers were rarely obvious. And because they were not obvious, decisions often depended on judgment rather than certainty. Judgment shaped outcomes, but judgment itself was influenced by culture, resources, experience, and circumstance. A wealthy household could afford consultation earlier. A poor household might wait longer. An urban resident might encounter medical expertise more easily than someone in a remote village. Access mattered. It always had. Yet even among the privileged, certainty remained elusive. A physician could offer advice, not guarantees. This distinction became increasingly important as larger outbreaks approached. The more severe the disease, the less reliable familiar expectations became. Communities that had spent generations developing practical knowledge about illness discovered that some situations resisted easy interpretation. Symptoms appeared that challenged established categories. Mortality patterns shifted. Recovery rates fluctuated. And, perhaps most unsettling of all, disease seemed capable of moving through social boundaries that normally provided protection. Wealth did not always help. Status did not always help. Education did not always help. The same fever could appear in a peasant cottage and a noble residence. This carried profound emotional consequences. Medieval society was deeply hierarchical. Differences in wealth, status, and power shaped daily life at every level. Yet disease possessed a troubling tendency to ignore those distinctions. Not completely, of course. Resources still mattered. Better nutrition, better housing, and better care could improve survival chances. But illness repeatedly demonstrated that social position could not eliminate vulnerability. Kings became sick. Bishops became sick. Merchants became sick. Monks became sick. Laborers became sick. The fever did not ask permission before crossing boundaries. This universality contributed to the cultural significance of illness. Disease became one of the great reminders of human fragility. Religious writers frequently reflected on this theme. So did chroniclers. So did ordinary people in their own ways. A fever could reduce even the powerful to dependence, could transform confidence into uncertainty, strength into weakness, plans into waiting. The experience forced confrontation with limits, and limits were becoming increasingly visible across Europe. Not only biological limits, institutional limits as well. Medical systems possessed limits. Charitable systems possessed limits. Religious institutions possessed limits. Communities could absorb a certain amount of suffering. Beyond that point, strain became visible. This realization emerged slowly. At first, many regions continued functioning normally despite reports of illness elsewhere. Markets remained active. Trade continued. Religious life proceeded according to familiar rhythms. The machinery of society kept moving. Yet beneath the surface, concern was growing. More reports arrived. More locations appeared affected. More stories sounded familiar. Patterns that once seemed isolated now appeared connected. The interconnected nature of the medieval world was becoming harder to ignore. Ironically, the very networks that created prosperity also accelerated awareness. Merchants spread information. Pilgrims spread information. Sailors spread information. Travelers spread information. The same routes carrying goods carried news. And increasingly, the news carried a common message. Something unusual was happening. No one yet knew precisely what that meant. Descriptions varied. Interpretations differed. Explanations competed. But the sense of normality was beginning to erode. Not collapse. Not yet. Simply erode. Slowly. Almost imperceptibly. A merchant hearing another troubling report. A physician noticing unusual symptom patterns. A monastery receiving news from distant religious houses. A town council discussing mortality elsewhere. Small moments, individually insignificant, collectively important. History often changes through accumulations rather than explosions. 1,000 small observations gradually alter how people understand their world. And by the time many medieval communities began recognizing that these reports might represent something larger than ordinary outbreaks, the networks connecting Europe, the Mediterranean, and beyond had already carried both information and infection much farther than anyone realized. In ports, caravanseries, market centers, and trading towns, the first scattered signs of a developing crisis continued to appear, and with each passing month, more observers found themselves comparing new reports with old ones and arriving at an increasingly uncomfortable conclusion. The stories coming from distant places were no longer remaining distant, and the next chapter of the fever's history would unfold not at the edges of the medieval world, but ever closer to the communities that had spent generations believing they understood the rhythms of sickness and recovery. Before we bring this long journey to a close, it is worth remembering how we arrived here. We began with something deceptively ordinary. A fever, not a famous battle, not a king, not a great cathedral, just a human body becoming hot, weak, and uncertain. And in following that single experience through the medieval world, we discovered something larger than illness itself. We found a society trying to understand forces it could not fully see. For medieval people, fever was never merely a medical condition. It was a household event, a community concern, a spiritual challenge, an economic burden, and often a deeply personal test of endurance. A fever could interrupt a harvest, delay a journey, empty a monastery bed, silence a workshop, or change the future of an entire family. Most of the people who lived through these experiences left no written records behind. Their names are lost. Their voices are silent. Yet their lives formed the foundation of medieval history. The farmer sweating through a summer night, the mother sitting awake beside a sick child, the monk praying in an infirmary, the healer mixing herbs by candlelight, the physician studying symptoms and searching for patterns, the priest offering comfort when certainty was impossible. These were not the famous figures who dominate history books, yet they were the people who experienced the medieval world most directly. And perhaps one of the most surprising lessons from their story is how familiar many of their fears remain. The explanations have changed. Medicine has changed. Our understanding of disease has changed beyond anything a medieval physician could have imagined. But the emotional experience of illness still carries echoes of the past. The uncertainty, the waiting, the hope attached to small signs of improvement, the relief when strength begins to return, the anxiety of not knowing what tomorrow will bring. Across centuries, those feelings remain remarkably recognizable. At the same time, there is another lesson hidden within the history of medieval fever. It is easy to look backward and focus on what people did not know. Yet doing so can obscure what they did know. They observed carefully. They cared for one another. They developed systems of explanation using the tools available to them. They accumulated practical knowledge through generations of experience. Many conclusions were wrong by modern standards, but the effort to understand was real. The medieval world was not filled with passive victims waiting for modern science to rescue them. It was filled with human beings doing what people have always done when confronted by suffering: observing, adapting, helping, hoping, and searching for meaning. That search shaped everything from household remedies to university medicine, from religious rituals to civic responses, from village traditions to international networks of learning. And in many ways, the history of fever is the history of that search. A search to understand why bodies fail, a search to reduce suffering, a search to find order within uncertainty. The story also reminds us that history is often hidden inside ordinary experiences. When people think about the Middle Ages, they frequently imagine castles, knights, crusades, and kings. But most medieval people spent far more time worrying about food, weather, work, family, and health. A fever may seem like a small topic compared to the grand events of history, yet following it closely reveals an entire civilization. Its beliefs, its fears, its knowledge, its limitations, its resilience, and perhaps most importantly, its humanity. If there is a single image worth carrying away from this documentary, it may not be a battlefield or a throne room. It may be a quiet room lit by firelight, a sick person lying beneath blankets, a family member keeping watch, a healer trying to help. Outside, the medieval world continues its routines. Bells ring, markets open, travelers arrive, seasons change. Inside that room, however, history becomes intensely personal. Everything narrows to a simple hope that the fever will break. Sometimes it did, sometimes it did not. And in that uncertainty lived one of the most universal experiences of the medieval age. Thank you for spending this time exploring the past with me. Before you go, I'd be curious to know, what detail about medieval illness surprised you the most? Or what part of daily life during a fever felt hardest to imagine living through? And if you enjoy these calm journeys into the realities of the past, you're always welcome to return for another evening of thoughtful history. For now, let the fire burn low, let the noise of the medieval world fade into the distance, and let the story rest here,